Hi, I'm Roger Barron, celebrating 5 years as a Pioneer sales rep from Northwestern Alberta, and this is the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. When it comes to Clubroot in canola, well, those that have it know just how destructive it can be. And as it gradually spreads itself across Western Canada, and even can be an issue in Central Canada for those growing spring canola, finding the right strategy to avoid the massive yield drag that comes with it is obviously key for anyone. So in today's episode, we dig deep into Clubroot management and are fortunate to kick things off with a research scientist at Corteva that's been looking at, dealing with, and trying to find solutions for Clubroot since day one of its discovery. Dan Stanton, thanks for joining the podcast.
Yeah, no problem.
So when we talk about Clubroot, I mean, your name was at the top of our list in terms of people to talk to because, and one of the big reasons is this has been a project of yours for your career, really, in terms of when it was first discovered in Alberta. Can you take us back to those kind of early 2000s, what that was like? And do you remember when you found it? Did you think it was going to be the problem it is today?
So I think it was identified in 2003 close to Edmonton by one of the agronomists just north of the city. And, Clubroot in Canada had no resistance to it. It's a disease that can produce hundreds of millions of spores out of every single gall that's produced in the plants. And it had a really long soil life from studies in Europe. So it was really scary for sure. We weren't sure if it was going to be we thought it was going to be a major threat to the industry if we didn't take a really, really proactive approach. And so we got started creating some resistance using some European material right away.
So then, I mean, it sounds like having that bit of a European experience kind of helped us anyway in the short term in those early days, just getting caught up.
Yeah, we're kind of lucky. We have breeding programs and winter canola in Europe. And so canola has been, infected with Clubroot in Europe for a long period of time. Clubroot's endemic to Europe. And so there were a few varieties out there that were resistant, and we could leverage those into Canadian varieties to get the first resistance out in Canada. First thing we had to do is test to make sure that resistance even worked. And so I think it was 2007, we got a collaboration going with Dr. Steven Strelkoff at the University of Alberta. And I set up basically a testing system to try to see if any of the stuff we were accessing would work in Canada.
Then if we go back again kind of to those early days and what we've learned over the last 20 years, because, as we know, not every canola field is impacted by it. This is very geographical in terms of where the impact is. Can you give those that don't have experience a bit of an idea, like what is the impact like and what have you seen as it's kind of marched its way around Western Canada?
So in the early days of Clubroot, the growers that had it initially knew lots about the impact because they're growing susceptible crops. The economics in Western Canada necessitate growing canola quite frequently. And so, there were huge spore loads in those fields that had Clubroot initially, and it really just devastated the crops. You could get massive stand reductions in really high spore loads. You get lots of gall formation. A lot of the grain filling happens throughout August in Western Canada here, especially in Alberta where it's cooler. And so if the roots are no longer capable of taking up water in August, you've basically lost most of your yield. Some of those fields, I'm thinking 20% is something that I remember from those early days. And so, if you take a 60 or 70 bushel canola crop that would bring a farmer a lot of profit and, make his organization pretty stable, reduce that to 20%, you're not even covering your costs anymore, right? So devastating disease. And every time you grow a susceptible and have those galls, you're increasing that spore load by millions of times. And so it's just going to be worse the next time. Like when the county stepped in and mandated 4 years off of canola for a lot of these growers, they probably wouldn't have gotten a crop in those 4 years anyway with some of the high spore loads that they had from growing susceptibles. So it was just devastating.
Yeah, devastating for sure. Then when you talk about those susceptible varieties, once some of those, resistant varieties started coming out, what's the impact been then, and how important is it really to make sure that that resistant variety is in there?
So the resistance made a huge difference. I mean, obviously growers could grow canola again in those areas where they had infestations. For a while there were growers that were kind of on the fringe areas, and they were kind of in denial about clubroot moving into their areas, and so they continued to grow susceptibles. And those guys, clubroot established on their farms and really has a probably forever footprint there now. As more and more of that got out, and growers started to realize that, hey, this is moving with wind and animals, and it's moving on equipment. There was a lot of equipment moving around the area because of rented land. Growers started being more proactive and growing resistance ahead of the infection. And so the ones that got the infection early on have quite a bad problem and often have some new resistance breaking types. Those ones that were proactive about it, they've prevented those spore loads from establishing on their farms, and generally are in a pretty good position right now for clubroot.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up when you talk about kind of the resistance breaking, that can happen, because obviously it's something that we're familiar in a lot of other areas. When we talk about the challenge that might bring in the future, you're on the research side. You're the one that's, kind of saving us from ourselves in this situation. What's it look like, and what's the future look like to make sure that we continue to have these resistant varieties?
If we think about things like wild oats or kochia, it's a pretty visible thing that you can see for resistance breaking. Wild oats, you're getting a few hundred seeds per plant. Kochia, I think someone told me there was 20,000 seeds on a plant. Clubroot, you're looking at 100, 200, 300 million spores from one plant. And so it's underground, you don't see it as well, but the resistance breaking we see in weeds is very similar to what we see in clubroot. With clubroot, what we have in Western Canada are pathotypes, and so it's in the field, within a gall, there's a mixture of different types within that. The ones that can overcome resistance that's in those cultivars, those are the ones that increase in that field. The ones that are controlled, they decrease over time. But because you're dealing with hundreds of millions of spores, there's going to be some resistance breaking spores within that spore population in pretty much every field and every gall. And so we have to be really careful about what we do with clubroot.
Then for you, what's you and your team, kind of working on? Where's this rank? Because I know it's not just to say that, okay, this is the only priority. Obviously, there's a lot of priorities all leading to the great challenge that yields got to improve. That's really, at the end of the day, for any grower, that's kind of priority number one. How does this rank, and how do you try to fit all of the different challenges that come with breeding new canola hybrids?
So we've taken clubroot as one of the major threats to canola production and one of the major threats to growers' organization or operations, basically. If you let clubroot get established, if you get these massive spore loads, basically you're going to put the resistance genes up against this unsurmountable challenge with this disease. There'll be these resistance breaking types within the populations. The resistance you have will eventually be useless, and we won't be able to grow canola. And so, while we're prioritizing yield as number one, clubroot resistance has been quite a high priority for us. And you can see within our lineup, basically early on, we realized that if we took single genes and put them up against clubroot one after another, the virulent ones within those populations would overcome those genes one by one, and we'd end up with nothing. There's not that many resistance genes that are easily accessible within canola, and so we quickly decided that what we were going to do is try to build a model system where we're going to stack genes. So we'll combine two genes together. That gives us a multiplicative effect, so we get a lot better resistance than a single gene. And then we'd also have rotational options. So if clubroot sees these two genes one year, the next year you'd have wheat, and then a lot of growers go back to canola again. We'd want different resistance genes in that next canola variety, so that the ones that increased on that two gene stack or, that clubroot resistant hybrid don't see the same resistance again. And so they don't continue building up in that field. And so it's a real proactive strategy. It's kind of something that Hasn't really been done much before, but we've got a lot of those options available now for growers.
Now, obviously, for growers where this is a challenge, this is something they're well aware of, they're well informed on, they're, taking that action. But then we've got areas that maybe are, close to Clubroot known areas, but, not necessarily known to have it. And you've got other growers that, think it's a long ways away yet. Can you give me an idea how important is it still to think about some of these resistant traits, particularly when it comes to some of these stack traits?
So prevention for Clubroot is really key. If a single plant can produce 100 million or 200 million or 300 million spores, that's a massive, massive amount of infectious particles in your field. It only takes about 1,000 spores per gram of soil to cause an infection. So, by the time you're getting a whole quarter section of infested with Clubroot, you're talking about trillions or quadrillions even of spores. And so that's a problem that doesn't really go away very easily. If you take a 2-year break from canola, so that most people just do a 1-year break from canola, they'll grow canola, wheat. If you grew canola, wheat, and then go back to canola, you'd have a 90% reduction in those spores. If you let it get to the point where you're in the quadrillions, dividing that by 10 still leaves you in the hundreds of billions of spores. And so you're going to have a huge problem, and it's not going to go away in just a couple of years. And so growers that don't have Clubroot yet really have a lot of tools available to help them. There's different resistance options out there, and they can use those to prevent Clubroot from ever establishing. If you've got a little piece of soil coming into your farm and, it's got a few thousand spores on it, if it hits a susceptible, then that's when it grows a big gall on that plant and makes hundreds of millions of spores. If it ends up with a susceptible plant near it and it doesn't produce any galls, then, in a year or two, those few thousand spores are down to a level where they're unlikely to even infect your canola. And so prevention is really the key to Clubroot. Not only prevention of the initial Clubroot infestation, but prevention of some of these new races from spreading, because some of them are much worse than others in terms of their ability to infect the new varieties.
Then when you do talk about prevention, Dan, can you walk me through maybe a couple of other things that producers need to remember and need to keep in mind? You mentioned rotation as being kind of an obvious one, but what are some of those other things that we maybe just need that reminder on in terms of how can we either prevent it from even landing, but if it does, maybe prevent it from spreading quite as quickly?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things is movement of soil. In the initial days of Clubroot, before that was understood, there was a lot of soil movement going on. Growers are busy, things can get muddy, equipment can carry massive amounts of soil on them, right? There were lots of growers that, trying to expand their farms usually has acreage all over the place now. And so you're moving from county to county, often moving equipment from county to county, moving across rivers and other natural barriers. If growers can get the soil off their equipment, that makes a huge difference because that equipment's going directly into where you're planting canola. Other industries have had to adopt practices to avoid movement of soil. And so, oil industry, you see a lot of rig mats out here now, a lot of washing stations, a lot of ways to prevent that move. Clubroot can still move. I mean, if you have a water course carrying soil from one field to another, if you have a lot of wind erosion happening, I've had a few growers say that where deer and moose and stuff cross into their field, they'll find Clubroot patches. And so, you have to assume Clubroot will get onto your field through different methods or means. And so putting a resistant variety down there is what prevents it from establishing there.
Well, it sounds like to me, the plan really needs to be this combination of, okay, we can maybe slow this to think that we can, stop, or completely eliminate it. I think, very much appears to be off the table. But as growers, the best mode really is, okay, how can we at least slow it down to, one, prevent it from, being everywhere real quickly, and two, to make sure that those resistant hybrids remain as absolutely effective as possible.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the goal. We can see some differences between different places and how Clubroot was handled. Leduc County put in 4-year bans immediately, and we're seeing some resistant breaking types in Leduc County popping up here and there. but there seems to be less diversity than what we see in, Sturgeon County or Westlock County. And I think some of that has to do with how much the spore load's built up and how many times the original resistance was deployed against it. Some of these places like Westlock County is where they first identified 5X, and there's quite a few different types now. And if on your farm you have a new type of clubroot that hasn't been seen before, it's unknown how many of these resistant hybrids will be able to prevent, galls from forming. And if you look over in Saskatchewan, where clubroot showed up after resistance showed up, the situation seems to be quite a bit better. We're not seeing as much of a race shift as we saw in the Edmonton area from those high spore loads. And, that really bodes well for longevity of these resistance genes and the ability to manage things.
Well, it definitely seems like, it's a challenge that we're going to have to continue to look at, but certainly appreciate you and your team's work on, continuing to try to find those hybrids that help at the end of the day get to the mark that, we all need, which is the yield. So thanks for that. And thanks very much for joining the podcast today, Dan. Now, with that background from Dan, we thought the best approach would be to move to what growers are actually doing now and can do in the future. For that, we met up with two growers in Saskatchewan, Garan Rewers of Cut Knife, Saskatchewan, and John Larre of St. Walburgs, as well as Corteva's portfolio marketing manager for Western Canada, Mark Kuchuran. Well, first of all, Mark, John, Garan, thanks very much for joining the podcast today. We just were talking with Dan a lot about kind of the history of Clubroot in Western Canada and some of the things that Pioneer and Corteva are doing in terms of bringing new hybrids to the market to try to support growers. Maybe I'll start with you, gentlemen, just to talk a little bit about what your experience with Clubroot is. John, my understanding is that you've got Clubroot in your area. What's your experience been with it?
I guess we first kind of got not involved, but found out we had Clubroot about 3 years ago, and I had a lot of background information when I started with Pioneer, so that kind of was more prepared to deal with it that way. And we've been using genetics and rotation as kind of our two biggest things. Cleaning equipment when we go into that area, and just trying to scout for it in other areas and hope it doesn't spread.
Hope. That seems like one of the things that growers want to try to do. You think that hope will get it, but you said 2 years ago was kind of when you found it. Was it a case of maybe you had it before then and it just keeps spreading, or like how did you determine you had it 2 years ago?
I'm sure it has been in the area for a lot longer than that, but the way the government came out and tested that land and came back with a positive test, so that's how we found out that we actually had it in that location. So.
Then, Garan, you don't have it specifically on your place, but we were talking a little earlier about how it's in the area. Like, what do you think of Clubroot? Is it something you worry about?
Yeah, we're concerned about it all the time. We use genetics and crop rotation to try to prevent it. And we just try to do all the easy things to prevent it.
When you talk about some of those easy things preventing it, what would some of the things be? Like you mentioned, crop rotation is obviously an easy one, just rotating it. But what are some of the other things you do?
Change up our genetics. We do try to be a little bit careful around when we're close to fields that we know have it. And we try to do them last in our rotation and moving machinery. And that's about it.
Mother Nature probably has a different strategy, though, when you're trying to do those fields last. So then is it a case of, some of the other places in the area that do have it? Are those growers having an impact in your area? Are they seeing yield drag?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you can pinpoint areas that have had it, and guys do watch them, and everybody's keeps an eye out. I don't think there's been any yield response.
Now then, Mark, in terms of, here's two growers that, either have it or are concerned about it. You're covering Western Canada. Is this common for every grower across Western Canada to be worried about Clubroot?
I think a large part of where the disease developed kind of in around the Edmonton corridor, when you think back a while ago, right? So a lot of those growers are familiar with Clubroot in that Edmonton corridor. And now it's expanded. If you look at the provincial Clubroot distribution maps, you can see how it's spread the last 4 or 5 years. So I think growers in Western Canada are starting to realize it more, and the disease is spreading from where it's originating, right? So they're taking precautions like these gentlemen mentioned already to manage the disease. But I think when you look even at the number of acres that clubroot resistant hybrids are growing on right now, there's about 75% of the 22 million acres of canola that have clubroot resistant genetics out there right now. Yeah, I think a large part of it is the industry realizes that the clubroot is a disease that we need to take seriously and need to be proactive on, right? So a lot of the hybrids that are being developed by us as well as other seed companies have clubroot resistance, right? So that's part of it. But also just growers knowing maybe to use a clubroot resistant hybrid if one doesn't have one, even if you don't have the disease, is kind of what our message is to a lot of the farmers in Western Canada.
Then in terms of, John, you've got it. How do you go about selecting some of those hybrids with, various types of resistance in them to try to prevent any big problems?
Just rotating the like CR1 to the CR2, and now Pioneer, I think there's 6 and 7. Not 100% sure on that, but yeah, just rotating the different genetics so you're not using the same one back to back. And 3-year rotation, so you'll be using the same genetic every 1 in 9 if it works out the right way. So that's kind of how we're trying to mitigate that.
Because, Mark, when we talk about that resistance, is it a case of, growing the same hybrid over and over and over again is going to be a problem down the road for growers?
Yeah, I think that's where we're starting to see some, breakdown of the first generation, if you want to call it, or the Mendel genetics, like the first 5 pathotypes of we initially came up with in our base genetics. And so as you grow that same resistant genetics on the piece of land, the pathogen kind of changes and morphs over time, right? So if you don't rotate those different hybrids with different pathotypes controlling, right, and growers not knowing what pathotypes they have in their seed hybrid, so that's why a large part of our message and our communication to farmers and also in the marketplace is that we want to tell the growers what pathotypes of clubroot that they're controlling with each hybrid and be able to rotate to those hybrids year after year or every second or third year whenever they're growing canola.
Then, Garan, you don't have it. Is that still something that you think about doing? Like when we talk about trying to prevent resistance of these genetics, is it something that you play around with hybrid selection because of?
Yeah, absolutely. Originally, as long as it said clubroot resistant, you bought it. But now everybody's getting a little more educated, and I think rotation of your clubroot CRs is important.
And Mark, it sounds like, this is a conversation we've had on, previous years of the podcast when we talk about weed resistance. This really is the exact same thing. It's just a disease in the soil.
Yeah, it's some of the, I guess, similarities between weed resistance and disease resistance are there, but obviously disease have a lot more spores, right? And this disease in particular moves in soil water, right? So when you got millions of spores in the soil water, it's hard to control, right? That's why it makes clubroot very difficult disease to control from field to field, right? And a lot of our field team now, and that's our message to the field, is to kind of minimize soil movement from the field too, to help control the spread of those. If you have a highly infected field in the Edmonton area and you're moving that soil and it's transferring to those new fields, right, infecting new crops, right? So that's part of the message too that we have, is try to minimize the soil movement as well as use resistance genetics to try to minimize the disease. Because if I think back to Edmonton, that Edmonton area was about 20 years ago, and now we've seen, when you look at the Alberta distribution map, it's spread quite a bit from Edmonton all the way into Saskatchewan and also in northern Alberta as well, right? So, and even Manitoba's got some areas if you look at the Manitoba map.
Yeah, I know no one probably wants to talk about this, but do you think part of the distribution of clubroot has to do with like where the oil field is heavily active and they're moving equipment back and forth? Because like where Edmonton is, where it started, a lot of oil activity up where we are in the northwest Saskatchewan. There's oil everywhere, and I know people don't want to point fingers, but I think that has a lot to do with it, with not cleaning equipment, and it's going back and forth in those areas.
Well, that and I wonder too, like, when you see what growers are today compared to 20 years ago, you're going further. Yep. Like, it just seems like between all of these reasons of equipment moving around, like, that probably has not helped the situation.
Yeah, I would say that was somewhat of the spread as well, right? Not the only problem, but I mean, even the Alberta agriculture has come out with like sanitization protocols, right? When you look at what they have on their website and some other, and moving field to field from the agriculture standpoint, they're trying to do some work even with the oil fields as well, right? To try to minimize that spread as well.
Then can you now walk us through a little bit, Mark, in terms of, this new hybrid, comes out of the lab. How do you go about ensuring that then is going to work, not just, in an area or in a plot that is very protected, but obviously in real world scenarios like John and Garen's?
Yeah, if I have to take it back just one little step, I mean, we've been breeding canola in Western Canada for 30 plus years, right? And so we started as kind of the leader in Clubroot. If I think back to 15 years ago when we first launched, H29 was a hybrid that we launched with the first Clubroot resistant hybrid on the marketplace, right? And so we've been breeding and developing and improving our say canola germplasm for a while, right? And on our breeders, we have 6 of them in Western Canada working on improving Clubroot. And Dan is one of them in our key canola growing areas, right? And so when I think about the resistance that he's breeding into those different hybrids, I guess, is like CR1 to CR7. So what we're doing is trying to use that information from our research team and communicate to farmers that, hey, Mr. Grower, this hybrid will control these pathotypes. This new hybrid will control different pathotypes and brings in new sources of resistance from our breeding program to help change it up so that the pathogens always is not effectively, the pathogen can infect those hybrids because it's a new source of resistance, right? And so the roots come out clean versus a CR1 that if you planted in some of those initial fields would be infected with clubroot galls, right? So if we can keep our genetics changing ahead of the pathogen is key, right? And it would be proactive approaches is what we're trying to strive for at Corteva.
And if I can just back up just 1 second for those that maybe haven't been focused on what sources of resistance are there. When you talk about CR7, what are you talking about there, and how does that set it apart from, past hybrids or other hybrids that are on the market?
Yeah, I should just back up a little bit. Like CR1 to CR7 is kind of our internal designation of the clubroot sources or genes that we're putting in there. It doesn't mean that CR1 isn't no good anymore versus CR7. It's not increasing like CR7's the best. We're just giving it different numbers to say this is a new source of resistance, so that CR5 might be just as good as CR7 in a field, but it's got a different clubroot package, so you could actually rotate 7 with a 5 or go back to if you had CR7 one year, you can go back to a CR3. You're just keeping that pathogen on its toes per se, I guess, right? And growing different clubroot hybrids that give you the yield that you want at the end of the day.
So then, John, in terms of when you are then going out to customers, with these new hybrids over the last few years and obviously moving forward, what's that conversation look like with those growers to say, here's 7 sources of resistance, but obviously is also going to perform in yield? What do those conversations look like?
Go out to the farmer and kind of just, if they grew like a CR1 last time, get them to move to the next one. And some farmers like that one variety, and they want to keep growing that same one over and over. Try to get them to change that and go to a different one, which is not easy and not everyone does it, but that's kind of how my conversation, I try and gear them towards the newer, not so much the newer varieties, but just a different one than what they've previously been doing.
And Garan, when you're picking hybrids, obviously, the speed at which these are coming out, continues to get faster and faster. What convinces you that this new hybrid is something you want to try or you want to put in more acres around your farm?
I guess normally the newest hybrids have the latest genetics and the highest yielding and other traits that we want. So it's a pretty easy sell to try to get a guy to grow the newer varieties.
And then in terms of like, is helped with that yield data, test plots? What else? Is it just a case of, your Pioneer rep comes and says, this is one you should try?
Yeah, it's a Pioneer rep. It's independent testing. We get all this information and you just look at it and I guess pick the information you want to use to make your decision.
So then in terms of, John, just as we kind of wrap this up, going forward, here's obviously the long journey we've had of Clubroot, gradually spreading to you having it 2 years ago, to you, let's be honest, probably getting it in the next few years. What do you think about in terms of managing Clubroot moving forward as it continues to, grow and spread across Western Canada, but obviously get worse in some fields over the next 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, I think honestly, if you have it on your own farm, be open with your neighbors so they can take the proper actions to kind of prevent it from moving. Because it really doesn't matter what you're doing; it's also what your neighbors are doing. If those water runs are coming onto your field or vice versa, it's going to spread. So, if you can encourage other people to do kind of the proper steps to prevent it, I think that's kind of the best thing to do. Is just make people more aware of it. Because there's too much of people just burying their head in the sand and pretending they don't have it, or just they don't care. I think there's too much of that in some areas.
And Garan, do you think about that in terms of, what the future looks like 5 or 10 years down the road? Or is it just a case of, as you were saying, managing it, as if it could be there already?
Yeah, I mean, you do manage it like you have it. If your neighbor has it, you have it. If the wind blows and the water runs, you're obviously going to get it. And nobody wants to get in a situation where they can't grow canola. So everybody's going to try to manage their best. My neighbors all try to manage it. I think it's taken care of pretty well in our area.
And finally, Mark, you get kind of last word here, just in terms of, where do you see and what are your kind of priorities for, seed going out the door at Pioneer? What are your priorities for the next 5 to 10 years to make sure growers can, as Garan said, like, you want to grow canola. It's too profitable not to, but how do you see that need to manage it over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, and I think at Corteva, our strategy is to have all new products with Clubroot resistance going forward, right? We're almost there. We just got a couple hybrids left, and then everything we would sell to a farmer would have Clubroot resistance, and that's our strategy, is to bring new hybrids out with new packages of Clubroot to continue to manage the disease and stay on top of it. We're doing, since the first year we released it, we've been trying to steadily improve it every year and get better at having high yield and disease packages for those farmers. And that's one of our key differentiators, I would say, is that our disease packages that we offer along with their yield. We're also working on pod shatter reduction improvements in all of our genetics. So to have that as well as the disease package with all the hybrids we sell is key. And we also have Optimum Glide, that we're a new herbicide tolerant trait that we're just launched in the market this year, and we're trying to get all those new Clubroot resistance genes that we have and the new sources built into those that germplasm as well.
Well, Mark, John, Garan, thanks very much for joining us today on the podcast. Next time on the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast, we take a look at another issue that needs a multi-approach strategy, and that's weed control in soybeans. There's no shortage of herbicide-resistant weeds, and having a plan to handle them will mean more bushels in the bin. That's next time. On behalf of the entire team working behind the scenes on this, we appreciate you listening. If you haven't already, you can always check out past episodes of the show in apps like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you download your shows. We're even on YouTube with new video episodes. You can follow Pioneer Seeds on Twitter at the handle Pioneer Seeds CA, or my personal handle, Fresh Air Farmer. And don't forget, if you're ever looking for more information or advice, just ask your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.